Hello, welcome to session 18 of the Nothing Human podcast Q&A. And I'm sorry I'm 1 minute late because I had some technical difficulties. I tend to have technical difficulties a lot. Anyway, so today I have a few things to talk about. My mom actually sent me a question preloaded, so that was really nice. So I can talk about that in a little bit. And I've really been thinking a whole lot about myth and fable within the scriptures, the way that the scriptures use myths and fables, um, because it's somewhat complicated. The Bible's use of certain natural stories, um, like I'll give you an example. I actually think I mentioned this in a previous episode about how the tongue is full of poison, like an asp or an adder, meaning a venomous snake. For a really long time, and this was an ancient idea, they had the idea that the tongue of the snake being forked like it was actually a stinger, and that is the way in which snakes delivered their venom. They didn't have slow motion cameras or anything like that, and they also didn't have the same level of emphasis on skepticism and observation in order to gather information. You've probably heard stories about the Greek perspective where it's like, well, it seems reasonable. And, they would see the snake flicking that tongue out and it looked pointy, and they knew that they were venomous and that people were affected by their poison. And so they, for a long time, there was the idea that that's the way the venom was actually administered, was through the sting of the tongue. You can see it's in Shakespeare, it's in all sorts of various different places, including in the scriptures where it talks about, it likens the liar or the serpent-like person to the serpent who stings with the poison of his tongue. It's almost like it's such a perfect metaphor and illustration that even after you know that that's not actually how the snake delivers its venom, there's a certain kind of poetic logic to it. You might call it the logic of metaphor, that is appealing and still works. And a lot of people have used things like that to discredit the scriptures, by saying, the scriptures was written by ancient people who didn't really know very much of anything, and so that's why they used these old stories and old wives' tales and stuff like that. So I obviously don't agree with that, but I also think that the factualist perspective, where you have certain people who think, well, if that must be true or natural reality in order for the scriptures to be reliable or trustworthy. I don't agree with that either. So I kind of feel myself a little bit at odds with both sides of this story. But I am fascinated by the ways in which the scriptures uses various different ancient, you could even call them misconceptions, in order to create metaphorical or sometimes more than just metaphorical connections. I mean, Jesus talks about, there's a passage where Jesus talks about if your eye is evil or if the light of your eye is dark, then the darkness will be within you. And that was, based on a ancient conception, which may not have scientific validity, but we're finding more and more actually has validity in reality. And the ancient conception was concerning the way in which vision worked. So our vision concept, our idea of optics, is mostly Newtonian, and you think that light enters into the eye, and the light that is reflected off of things, in various ways. That's where we get colors and shapes and everything like that, is from the reflections off of various different things that enter into our eyeball. So the light comes from outside of us. That's called the intramission theory of optics. But you did have an extramission theory, meaning like the light came from the eye, and we still have certain aspects of our language that preserve that. Like, for instance, when you say that somebody has bright eyes or the light of your eyes or these kinds of things, you're actually referring back to an ancient concept that vision happened because a person had light, kind of like a little lamp, in their eye that kind of shined upon things. So it wasn't so much that that things were objective realities that kind of came into you, like you were just an absorber of data. It was more that you saw onto things. And Newton comes along and he's like, no, you don't see onto things. Light comes into your eyeballs. And so, you have this perspective that the ancients are really ignorant of these scientific realities. But, recently, even in this case, more and more, there's an understanding that, yes, there is light and information that's coming into the eye. But in some ways, the mechanics and structures of the eyeball and the interpretive mechanisms of the brain do constitute, to some extent, a seeing onto things, so that you can't really say that your vision is just an objective absorption of sensory data. So turns out that there's some value to both an extramissional and intramissional view of optics. And but that's just one example of the way that the Bible uses what at the time would be considered a misconception of the ancients. It sort of just borrows from it or pulls from it as if it is at least known and therefore able to be used at least for metaphorical purposes. And so I've been doing a little bit of work on ravens in the Bible because it's pretty fascinating. But particularly for my article series on called Questions in Genesis, I'm doing an article on the story of the raven and the dove after the flood account, which is actually the whole reason I started the Questions in Genesis series, because it was just, well, because there's so much detail in the story, and that was really bizarre to me. Because in most ancient narratives, the details are pretty light, it's pretty skeletal storytelling. And so, okay. And so, given the fact that it's this very skeletal storytelling, when it adds these details, I'm replying to my wife. When it applies these details in a story, you start thinking, okay, there's probably a good reason for that. So I'm looking at the story. There is a huge amount of detail about this raven that Noah sends out, and then it comes back, and then he sends it out. It doesn't come back. He sends out the dove. The dove does come back after. So it's like the raven first and then the dove, and the dove comes back with the olive branch and all these other kinds of details that are in this process of trying to find out about the dry land. That is a really odd amount of detail for a story that almost includes nothing at all about Noah's relationship to the animals on the ark, and he's on there for a long time. So you'd think, if it was so important to talk about his relationship to these various animals, you might hear a little bit about, I don't know, feeding the elephants or whatever, something. But it doesn't mention any of that. And then at the very end, you have this kind of long, fairly detailed story about him, dealing with the raven and the dove. So anyway, so I was looking into it thinking there's got to be something here. And one of the things that I found about ravens in the Bible, which doesn't have very much to do with this story, although it is interesting, is that the raven, there was a commonly held idea, and it still is a commonly held idea in certain areas, where where in ancient times they thought ravens did not feed their young. So the reason for this is that ravens do have a very strange parenting strategy. They actually have their young leave the nest long before their young can actually care for themselves. They monitor them and sometimes will intervene and give them food, but it's part of their parental strategy of getting those ravens more on board with like taking care of themselves. And so what it looked like to the ancients is that the ravens weren't feeding their young, and that the young would be out of the nest, not being cared for, squawking like crazy because they're hungry, and the assumption was, well, I guess their parents are just like really selfish and don't care for them. So that became a certain kind of idea. You can see it referenced in various different parts of the scripture. Um, for instance, the Job asked the question, "Who prepares for the raven its nourishment when its young cry to God and wander about without food?" Um, okay, so the idea being that the young are crying out to God because only God can feed them because their parents aren't going to feed them. Um, there's also the idea that you can see the same thing when in Luke, Jesus says, "Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom nor barn, yet God feeds them." So this idea of God feeding the ravens is in the scriptures in various different places. And typically it's, you have these young and they're not being cared for. Okay, so that's the natural. I don't even know what you call it, like a natural myth or a natural misconception, misconception about the natural world. And there are actually various different ones of those throughout the scriptures, as we said, with the tongue of the venomous snake being the stinger or the place where the poison is delivered. And this idea of the raven as being sort of a bad parent that doesn't care for its young and lets the young sort of cry out for food, and God has to feed them directly. Those comments actually generated a huge amount of additional Christian and Talmudic literature. There's a lot of Talmudic literature and Christian literature about the significance of the raven not returning to the ark, and sort of like giving the raven just a, generally speaking, really, really bad reputation. Um, and the complication of a lot of this is, well, for one, there seems to be a logic to the metaphor that's somewhat distinct from reality, but is obviously connected to reality. I mean, like I said, the whole thing with the poison in the tongue connected to the serpent who is a liar and a murderer, that just kind of seems like so tasty, like so appropriate. Like, why wouldn't you put those things together and utilize that as a metaphor? I mean, it's possible that Shakespeare actually knew that that wasn't true. But still, when he used that metaphor of the sting of the tongue, which, produces this venomous product, ultimately leading to death or harm, he's sitting here going like, I, I just like this idea. This idea is itself a really great idea, which I agree with him, right? I mean, don't you agree? Like it's an idea that feels like it should be true, and it's like when you find out, well, actually, it's not true, it doesn't really matter all that much. You're like, well, yeah, but I like it anyway, right? So, anyway, the what I want to do then with the book that I'm writing on truth is I want to have a little bit of a discussion of the way that the scriptures uses myth and all sorts of things like that, fable, the way it incorporates those, and talk about this truth, that in some ways the scriptures are utilizing these things because they have metaphorical value. Yes. Is it possible to say that the authors were under those misconceptions and still free the Bible itself or God's intentions in the Bible from those misconceptions? Meaning, is it possible that the authors themselves even believed these misconceptions, but that God still utilizes those metaphors because they're useful? And that they still actually deliver some kind of truth, even if it's not a naturalist or a scientific truth in the way that we would typically connect to, like observational science. I'm not 100% sure. I will say that the scientism of our time has not really yielded a great respect for the truth in general, and I think that there are a lot of ways in which the scriptures' approach to the truth is much more robust. as we've seen even with the whole extra mission theory, and a lot of the ancient conceptions, more and more we're saying, well, when viewed from a more right brain perspective or a more metaphorical perspective, there is a huge amount of truth here that's kind of lost in the scientific naturalism of our time. So anyway, I'm really curious about that. I'm doing a lot of work on it for the book and a lot of research. I mean, and for this article, I'm reading a fascinating book right now. I read a book that was about the uh, about snakes, and it had a whole section in it on this issue of the long-standing myth that snakes stung with their pointy tongues. And then now I'm reading another book called Birds in Legend, Fable, and Folklore, and it addresses a lot of these same things. The ideas of the concerning the raven. It gets a generally bad rap because people, it's associated with death, and people think it's like an omen of doom oftentimes. So anyway, there's lots of things with ravens that I'm going to be pulling together for this article. Anyway, so if you have any questions about that or you're interested about that at all, you can let me know, and I'll try and incorporate it in this article, but and into my book. Okay, so if you have any questions and you're here on the chat, feel free to ask me those questions on the chat. I had to take my teleprompter and not have it on because the chat was too small, and anyway, so whatever. Okay. So I got a question from my mom that I'll go through today. She says she'd like to hear about the leaven of the Pharisees that I was talking to my cousin Rebecca about recently. And my mom was overhearing the conversation, and she's curious about this idea of the leaven of the Pharisees. There's a few different ideas that are connected together concerning leaven in the scriptures from the get-go. And this actually, it does connect somewhat to this, the use of the natural world as a space of metaphor. I don't want to make too much of a separation. I know there is a discrepancy between the material world and the spiritual realities that gave birth to them. And so I think you have to be careful that you don't overly identify them. And I think you also have to be careful that you don't overly separate them. Because there is an interplay, but there is to some extent a feeling of conflict between them sometimes. So it's important not to over-resolve the relationship between the material world and the spiritual world through metaphor or symbol. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit. But the idea of leaven in the scriptures, it has a complicated history in the scriptures. Obviously, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Israelites were commanded to remove all leaven from their houses. So that means, and again, when you're thinking leaven, you might be thinking, quick rise yeast that you've got in your freezer, and you just pop it out and you throw it out there, you warm it up, and it causes your bread to rise. And that is a form of yeast. But they obviously didn't have lab-grown monocultural yeast that they kept in a freezer in ancient times. So when you read about leaven, or a leaven being there in the Old Testament, what you're actually reading about is starter, like sourdough starter, basically. And so what that meant was they had to take the starter that they had out of their house, and they actually had to take it outside of the camp and destroy it, like bury it. And they had to take all leavened products and everything that had any leaven out of their houses, out of their communities, outside of the camp, and so have a totally leaven-free environment. Now, nowadays, that's not that big of a deal. A lot of Jews still do this, and they'll take all their bread products, all their leavening products out of their house. And they actually, generally speaking, nowadays it's funny, they'll give it to a Gentile. So they'll give their bread products to a Gentile to be returned after this week, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was one whole week where they didn't eat any leavened bread and they didn't have any leaven in their houses. And um, obviously there was a meaning or a purpose that God was attempting to display there in this removal of the leaven. It wasn't that God says leaven is always bad, but I will say that there's a deep connection between the spiritual reality of spirit and the material reality of leaven and or bacteria and or those things which produce air, those things which produce and or consume air. Because the breath of life is like the actual word for spirit in the Old Testament, ruach, can mean breath or and does connect to that idea of like wind or breath or air, right? So that and this actually holds for the Greek as well. That pneuma, can mean wind or air or breath, as well as spirit, because the spirit was connected to air. I mean, I'll give you like a kind of funny story about this in the ancient times, but like Pythagoras, who made the Pythagorean theorem, he was the leader of a mystery cult whose first commandment actually of the mystery cult. So you probably know like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagorean theorem. That was one of the mysteries of enlightenment that you would get if you swore a death oath to this mystery cult of the Pythagoreans. If you ever shared the Pythagorean theorem with anybody else after having been initiated into its mysteries, you could be killed. I mean, that was a thing. Like they would kill people for sharing the Pythagorean theorem. So makes it a little more exciting, if you ever have to teach that to kids, just tell them, like people died for this at one point, Anyway, but the story of Pythagoras is that well the first command of the Pythagorean mystery cult was eat no beans. It was eat no beans, and the reason you weren't allowed to eat beans is because you might fart. I'm not even joking. It's hilarious, but and if you passed gas, the Pythagoreans believed that when you breathed out, you lost some of your spirit. When you breathed back in, you regained that spirit. And so, in the process of breathing, you exhaled and inhaled spirit. No net loss of spirit. However, if you passed gas, that was a net loss of spirit because, you're not breathing in any gases, you're just passing air, which is spirit. And so they would say, you can't pass gas because if you do that, then you lose net spirit. So eat no beans and, don't ever pass gas. You could burp. Burping was fine because, again, that was exhalation. You're still inhaling, net loss of spirit, 0. So, you're good. You're breaking spirit even here. But net negative on passing gas. So don't do that. Anyway, pretty absurd, but it does indicate the idea of air and spirit being kind of connected together in the ancient mind. Okay, which is really important because what leaven produces invisibly, see, again, now we're thinking scientifically, it's like, well, it's not invisible. Well, it is invisible in the sense that it's not visible to the naked eye. So this mysterious thing that went into your bread, and what did it do? It filled it up with spirit. It actually inspirited your bread. And it's an invisible thing that produces air, right? It produces spirit in your bread. And so the idea of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was, in a sense, to have a total removal of all spirit from your house, of all foreign spirit, of all spirit. Really, it was kind of like a test of the spirit, in a sense, right? To go back to a total emptiness or lowliness of spirit. And the reason for that was that well, there was the understanding that the spirit that we have before God should be granted by God. So one of the interesting things, because people will talk about even in the Lord's Supper, they'll say, well, if it's mostly connected to Passover as a fulfillment of Passover, then we should use unleavened bread in the Lord's Supper. Not all traditions do use unleavened bread. Some traditions use leavened bread, and there are actually sacrifices that do require leavened bread. For instance, and really interesting, um, the bread that was offered at Pentecost was leavened bread that was made with new leaven. Because this is the thing, is if you have taken all of your leaven out of your community and you have buried it and destroyed it, and you're not allowed to bring it back in, or you're abomination, you're cut off from the people or whatever, then think about the fact that what that means is you'd have to restart your starter. And, I mean, if you've ever started a starter, you know that you can start one from scratch. You just put flour and water together, and you let it sit and, for a day or whatever. And then you kind of refresh it. You kind of scrape some out and put some new flour and water in there. And if you do that for, 3, 4, 7 days or so, you will actually produce new leaven. Now, obviously, it is collecting the bacteria and the yeast and et cetera, from probably mostly from the wheat berries themselves that that you're grinding. But it's actually the case that to the ancients at least, it would be like, well, this is like a new spirit. And so in a sense, at Pentecost, because Pentecost again it's called Pentecost because it's 50 days after Passover. So Passover begins, you eat unleavened bread with bitter herbs, and you have a week of unleavened bread, and then 50 days or 49 days or whatever, 7 weeks of 7 after that, you have Pentecost. That the bread that was offered at Pentecost was leavened, meaning that you started a new starter at the end of the week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then that is the starter that you would actually be making leavened bread for the Pentecost. So it would give you, a good month or so to get your starter into good shape again, before you started making leavened bread again. Okay, but that means that what you're presenting to God at Pentecost is a new spirit that He has granted to you in your time of repentance, after your time of unleavened bread. Okay, so that's all I think interesting, but Paul makes a lot of this when he talks about that the unleavened bread of sincerity. So let me look this up real quick. I hope I can find it quickly. But Paul actually makes this point, the unleavened bread of sincerity. Let's see if this works. Yes. So in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 8, it says, "Therefore let us celebrate the feast not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." So he's connecting very clearly this idea of not the old leaven that you remove from your lives in repentance, nor with a new leaven of malice and wickedness, which in a sense was the perversion of religion that the Corinthians were going through in their seeking for power and status, but rather he wants them to have the unleavened bread of sincerity and of truth. So we can say that the unleavened bread in the Feast of Unleavened Bread indicated a certain kind of nakedness before God, a sincerity and truth before God. So I think that gives us somewhat of a background for what the leaven of the Pharisees was. For one, you could say that the leaven of the Pharisees is a spirit. You can also say that the leaven of the Pharisees is not sincere and is not true. It is false and insincere, which obviously you can see that the spirit of the Pharisees is that. It's mostly connected to pretense and things like that. Okay, the other part of it, though, that's interesting, is that it also connects to this idea of being puffed up with pride, even though in fact you're empty, which again connects to the insincerity, the falseness of their shows of religion. So, in those terms, I would say that the way to fight against the leaven of the Pharisees is actually to be sincere and to be truthful, honest. That honesty sometimes can take, various different forms. Sometimes, the most honest and straightforward people don't seem like the most righteous people, right? I mean, they oftentimes, if they're really telling you what's going on with them, you're like, ooh, this guy's a real mess. I know a lot of people have viewed me that way, and I mean, that's okay. I am a mess. That's part of the whole thing here. That's why, in some sense, that we live a life of repentance. We offer to God an empty hands. Like I need God to fill me. I need God to grant me a new and renewed spirit. And I can't bring to him a spirit of my own or mix my own spirit into his spirit, thinking that I can offer him a mixture of spirits or anything like that. It's very important to God that we come to him with a certain kind of openness and emptiness that he then is able to fill. But that takes a lot, oddly, a lot of work to remove from ourselves and remove from our lives all of the old leaven of that Pharisaical approach to religion, which attempts to gain God's favor through a perfect appearance. But that's just puffed up. It's just pride. It's not. There's no substance in it. It would be better to have the flatbread of sincerity, even though it doesn't look like much. It is what it is, and that is what God desires from us spiritually. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. There's a lot more to it, obviously, but I would say that the invisible, infectious nature of the falseness of false religion is partly what's in Jesus's mind. That's why he says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." It's very easy to be infected with the idea that my acceptance before God is to whatever extent based on my performance, and therefore I have to have an appearance of good performance, and that's the only way that God would receive me. No, not so much. That it is the righteousness and the Spirit of God that we receive, and in a sense that in cooperation with that we present back to God the Spirit that He has granted us and that we have received and collaborated and partnered with. Okay. And also, interestingly, Pentecost was the time in the New Testament when the Holy Spirit actually was poured out upon the apostles, which was such a fascinating idea that it was the Holy Spirit and not their own spirits that was filling them with that truth and that sincerity. If they had not been willing to deny themselves and even deny their own aptitude, acceptability before God, and say, have mercy on me, then they would not have been in a place where they could have received the Spirit in those terms on Pentecost, and a final fulfillment of the sign of that, of Pentecost, from all the way back to Sinai, because it was actually at Sinai, the original Pentecost, when God had first granted the people his presence and his law. Okay, so that draws a lot of those things together. I hope that was interesting. So Colleen is asking me, if God is timeless, how does he act within time or respond to prayer? I mean, the short answer is I don't know. But just because God is not bound by or subject to time doesn't mean that he wouldn't be able to operate within it. It's sort of like the best example I can give of this, or the best image or idea. I'm really fascinated by this book called Flatland. It's by, I think it was by like a mathematician named Edwin Abbott. But it has the premise of the book. It's kind of science fiction. It's like mathy fiction or something. But it's a two-dimensional reality with two-dimensional beings who are visited by a three-dimensional being. And the book is sort of about the ways in which the two-dimensional beings view the three-dimensional beings, and how the three-dimensional being has to present himself in two-dimensional ways in order to interact with the two-dimensional beings. The two-dimensional beings also don't have any real concept or idea of what does it mean to live in three dimensions. Like, they don't have any concept of it. But you can imagine that a three-dimensional being outside of the limited two-dimensional reality is actually able to, in a sense, see the whole of it and interact with it, even though the interactions are by necessity accommodated to those two dimensions. Einstein says a hilarious thing in his book. Okay, so Einstein did the special and general theories of relativity, and he wrote, obviously, a really complicated, very, very mathematics heavy version of that for whoever he considered even his peers, which he didn't have very many. He had maybe a few people that probably understood it at the level that he did, including like Kurt Gödel, who's a friend of his, who also did the incompleteness theorem, which I'm a big fan of. So if you've ever heard me talk about them. But Einstein says this hilarious thing in his dumbed down version of the book, which still contains huge numbers of equations and stuff. So like Einstein apparently had a very high perspective on what the masses were able to comprehend. But in it, he says there's nothing more elementary or rudimentary than the idea that we're living in a four-dimensional reality. And in his mind, the fourth dimension was time. So if you think so that's why I think the book Flatland by Edwin Abbott kind of gives us a little bit of an idea, window into what it might be like for God, who, if he's beyond time, he's not functioning within time the way that we are, which means in some ways it's almost like he's looking at the whole thing from beyond it. Almost in the same way that if you were, again, if you were a three-dimensional being, the plane of the two-dimensional reality would look like something that you were able to see the whole of. You wouldn't exist within it. You would actually exist beyond it. And so you'd be able to interact with it as if it were something that were entire and complete to you. Whereas, a two-dimensional being who's inside the page, they're not looking at it as a page, they're inside of it. And so to them, the horizons and the, all that stuff is something that is beyond them. But to a three-dimensional being, you would look at it almost like you would look at, a page. You would just see the whole thing. All right. Anyway, so that is... that's what I would say is similar to God, that he's looking at reality, even with time included, almost like I'm looking at this page, that it's a complete thing and that I can see the whole of it. And in that way, I can interact with it. But obviously, as far as if you're inside the page, your experience of my interactions within it are going to be extremely limited. And there's a really interesting concept even within Flatland where he talks about the two-dimensional being's confusion about the various ways that the three-dimensional being is represented in two dimensions. For instance, if the three-dimensional being, was like a sphere or whatever, and he's, coming down into the page, when he first touches the page, he looks like a point to the two-dimensional people. When he's midway, halfway through, he becomes an increasingly large circle until he becomes a point again and then disappears. But he's able to appear and disappear. And to them, it's like, well, were you here and then you weren't here? And it's like, well, no, I am a three-dimensional being. And they're like, what does that mean? Do you see? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff in the book that I think is helpful to us to understand. It's not that any of the interactions God has with us are false. It's just that because they're accommodated to our own limitations, there are certain aspects of it that don't seem to make sense within our conception of reality. Like, how could you be both a point and ever growing and then a shrinking circle, appear and disappear in our space, and not just cease to be? These kinds of things. How does that work? It makes total sense once you think about the three-dimensional reality and the fact that the sphere is functioning in three dimensions, and this page is just a limited plane. Then it makes sense a lot more. Then once you be like, okay, well, what would it be like for a five-dimensional being? Let's say if God lives in 5 dimensions or more, what does it mean for him to function in in this four-dimensional world? And there'd be a lot of very similar confusion, a lot of similar accommodation that would occur that we might not be able to wrap our heads around it. But that's, maybe that's a way into a thought about the question, Colleen. But I will say, the idea of God being timeless is not the idea that he is not able to function or interact within time or within space, because obviously he can. He became a man, so that's one way, right? But those kinds of interactions were happening before, long before he ever became enfleshed. So the incarnation, to some extent, was the final realization of that interaction with time and space. But he was already able to, and obviously interacting with time and space before then. Okay, so anyway, I hope that is helpful. And if not, I guess I can talk to you about it later. All right. Philip Hodges says, thanks for the recent episode. I've been patiently waiting for it. I know, since December. Anyway, it was great and gave me a lot of insight. Well, you're welcome, Philip. Thanks for being such a faithful listener to the podcast. And it did take me a while to get that podcast out. However, it was I think it worked out pretty well. I was pretty happy with it. I always enjoy when I do an episode and I feel like I discover something in the episode that I was not expecting at all, and that is definitely what happened with this episode. I just felt like what, and I really did not expect at all that I was going to find out, for instance, that the kingdom of heaven probably isn't in heaven. That was a weird one. um, I didn't expect to. I honestly didn't. I really, really did not. Like, that's not what I was expecting to find. I was looking up because I knew about the prayer, the Jewish prayer that they pray. Basically, a lot of Jewish prayers will begin with, "Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe." And then it'll have some connection to, who gives sleep to my eyes, or who revives me in the morning, or who made this, wine that I'm about to drink, or the water that I'm about to drink. It's a great prayer. I have no issue with the prayer, but I just expected, for some reason, I was like, well, they had to have drawn that from Old Testament realities, and it just isn't in the Old Testament very much. I mean, David calls God his king a lot. Although it's unclear, especially when you're looking at Psalm 2, which makes very clear that God has an anointed king that he has placed on his holy mountain. And, and then you have David saying things like, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." So the question would be like, did David have some sort of rudimentary idea of a Trinitarian relationship that made it so, like, God had his king who ruled here on earth over the domain of his holy nation? And in some sense, did David even view himself to some extent as that? Potentially. I'm not really sure. But what is very clear is that the idea of God as the king of the universe, or the idea of heaven as a kingdom or a kingdom domain, isn't really very prominent in the Old Testament. like I looked up like King of the Universe, for instance, thinking certainly that occurs a bunch, right? No. Like King of the Heavens and the Earth, no. That occurs like one time, and Nebuchadnezzar is the one who says it. And again, I mean, like I'm not saying it's wrong to call God King of the universe. It's just that's not what it says so very much, because that's not really emphasized. And maybe God accepts it from Nebuchadnezzar. He's like, yeah, I get that you would think that I was king of the universe, but I'm not really king. I'm God. So king's kind of a demotion for me, um, you know. So anyway, I that was a really fascinating thing that I was finding over the course of it, where it's like God is called the creator, the possessor, the God of the heavens and the earth, but in almost no places in the Old Testament is he talked about as king of the universe or even king of heaven. Um, Now, Jesus is called that, which is makes sense. Which again, it's like, well, yeah, when Jesus came, he came as the king, the anointed king, the Messiah, Christ, like the fulfillment of Psalm 2. But again, he came here and he brought the kingdom of heaven here. So it's like in the episode, and you can please do listen to it. Um, I was working through some of the implications of that, and I was kind of surprised, honestly, by what I found to be the case. I did not expect that to happen. All right. Um, well, thank you, Philip, for listening. And if you have any questions about the oddness of that or anything that's in it, feel free to ask me at any point. I have, I mean, the next one on the Nothing Human podcast is going to be on the fourth petition, I think. I think it's the fourth petition, which is give us this day our daily bread. And I've got a lot to say about that as well, because that in every one of these cases, the wording of the scriptures, it's really hard with the Lord's Prayer. It's hard with the Ten Commandments as well, because we're already so used to them being worded in a certain way. And so when translators come in, even in modern translations, and they want to update the New American Standard or the English Standard Version or the NIV or anything like that, it's really hard for them to get away from traditional wordings for these things. They can update them a little bit, but they just, like if they were to change it massively from what is already there and has kind of been there since the days of the King James Version, you can imagine there'd be a lot of church ladies and other people like that who might call in and just be like, hey, you guys are heretics and evil and you've destroyed the scriptures and I'm not going to buy your translation. And so that would be really bad, if nobody bought their translation. So anyway, so a lot of times you'll see that people will stick pretty close to some version of the King James version of these texts, which is fine. I have no issues with it. I mean, it's not like they're terrible translations. The problem is that there are certain aspects of the original language that are affected by that. So I just want, I want to do a little bit of work to kind of get into the text in its original format in the original languages and unpack it a little bit for you so that when you go back to praying the Lord's Prayer or saying the Ten Commandments or whatever else it may be, that you have a little bit more of a larger background for that for you. And I think that it'll help you to contemplate and to think about what you're actually praying while you're praying it, rather than just having rote words, rote memorization come out, just saying those words and not really thinking about what it is that you're actually saying, what it is that you're actually asking with the prayers. So that was my intention with this series, and I hope it's been helpful to you all along those lines. All right. Well, that's about all I've got for today. I do plan on trying to get another episode out uh, probably next week, and I think it should be a little faster. I'm really sorry about how long it took me to do the last episode. I've been working on treatments in the studio rather obsessively, and then I went to Nebraska, and so I kind of dropped off the map in terms of regular rhythm for the podcast. I hope to remedy that. I have actually been pretty good about live streaming every other week, so I'm kind of proud of that because this is session number 19, which I can't even believe that I've already done 19 of these. And I just want to thank all of you for being so supportive and consistent and showing up and listening to my ramblings and asking good questions and just being wonderful, encouraging people. I really appreciate it a lot. So thank you all so much for showing up and consistently being here. And I am going to sign off, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. And Lord willing, I'll have another episode for you next week. All right. Okay. Well, have a great night. Until next time.